At the height of Silicon Valley's golden era, one company stood out as the ultimate symbol of innovation and ambition. Its founder was hailed as the female Steve Jobs, a college dropout. With a black turtleneck, a piercing stare, and a promise to change healthcare forever. The company was called Theranos, and the dream was breathtakingly simple run, hundreds of blood tests from just a few drops of blood. Investors, politicians, generals, and even global corporations lined up to be part of what was seen as the future of medicine. The story had everything youthful genius, cutting-edge technology, and the seductive idea of saving millions of lives while building a multi-billion-dollar empire. But behind the glossy magazine covers and the billion-dollar valuation, there was a secret no one wanted to admit. The machines didn't work. The miracle technology was nothing more than smoke and mirrors propped up by intimidation secrecy and an almost religious belief in the vision of Elizabeth Holmes. As the lies unraveled, what began as Silicon Valley's brightest star would collapse into one of the greatest scandals in corporate history, leaving shattered investors, misled patients, and a founder who would soon face prison. This is not just the story of a failed company. It is the story of how ambition, deception, and blind faith can build an empire and destroy it overnight. Stay with us as we dive into how Theranos rose, how it deceived the world, and how it all came crashing down. The story begins in 2003 when a 19-year-old Stanford dropout named Elizabeth Holmes decided she had found her calling. She was young, ambitious, and spoke with a deep voice that seemed rehearsed for authority. What set her apart was not just her intensity, but her audacious claim she had discovered a way to perform hundreds of diagnostic tests using only a few drops of blood. It was a vision that promised to revolutionize medicine, to make testing faster, cheaper, and more accessible to everyone. With that idea, Holmes founded Theranos, a name she crafted from combining therapy and diagnosis, a signal of her ambition to heal the world. From the beginning, she used the power of storytelling to her advantage. Professors at Stanford recalled how she would corner them with endless pitches about her technology, brushing aside doubts with a mix of confidence and charisma. Most scientists were skeptical. They knew the science was far more complicated than she let on. But Holmes had no interest in hearing why her dream was impossible. She framed herself as a visionary, someone destined to change the world, and she quickly realized that Silicon Valley did not reward caution, it rewarded bold promises. With her striking appearance, unwavering conviction, and a wardrobe modeled after Steve Jobs' famous black turtlenecks, she cast herself as a messiah of innovation. Investors soon took notice. One of her earliest backers was Tim Draper, a venture capitalist who happened to be a family friend. Draper provided seed money, believing in Holmes's conviction and her narrative of disruption. Once she secured her first funding, Holmes was relentless in expanding her network. She courted wealthy individuals, leveraging personal connections and presenting herself as a once-in-a-generation founder who could transform healthcare. She claimed her device, later known as the Edison, could perform a full spectrum of tests using just a finger prick of blood. It sounded like science fiction, but in an era obsessed with move fast and break things, no one wanted to miss out on the next Apple or Google. The pitch was irresistible, not only to investors, but also to the public. Imagine a world where dangerous diseases could be detected early, where trips to clinics were replaced by a simple drop of blood at your local pharmacy. Holmes presented Theranos as both a business opportunity and a moral mission, making her story even harder to resist. She tapped into the cultural fascination with genius outsiders who defied the establishment, and she embraced every opportunity to remind people of her comparisons to Jobs and other icons. As millions of dollars poured in, Theranos built laboratories, hired engineers, and constructed an image of a groundbreaking company. Holmes spoke with conviction about how her technology would eliminate the pain and inefficiency of traditional blood draws. She attracted some of the most powerful figures in America, not by proving the science, but by evoking the dream of transforming healthcare. For Holmes' doubts and scientific challenges were just obstacles on the path to inevitable success. She surrounded herself with people who echoed her vision pushing forward, without the kind of rigorous scrutiny one would expect in medicine. By the mid-2000s, the foundation of Theranos had been laid not on verified technology, but on a story so powerful that it silenced the skeptics. And with every new round of funding, the myth of Theranos grew larger, setting the stage for a rise unlike anything Silicon Valley had ever seen. As the years moved forward, Theranos transformed from a bold idea into a Silicon Valley darling. By 2014, the company reached a jaw-dropping valuation of $9 billion, and Elizabeth Holmes, at only 30 years old, was celebrated as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect story of disruption, a new kind of American dream fueled not by oil or steel, but by science and innovation. Holmes became the face of the future, smiling on the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Inc., her signature black turtleneck carefully styled to echo Steve Jobs. The comparisons weren't accidental. She leaned into the myth, adopting his mannerisms, his wardrobe, and even his obsession with secrecy. She wanted people to see her not just as a CEO, but as a visionary destined to rewrite the rules of healthcare. Investors were quick to buy into this persona. Unlike many startups, Theranos did not rely on venture capital firms that specialized in analyzing risky technology. Instead, Holmes cleverly targeted wealthy families, influential individuals, and former statesmen who lacked the expertise to question her science but had the prestige to legitimize her company. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Defense Secretary William Perry, and former Secretary of State George Shultz all joined the board of Theranos. These names created a shield of credibility so powerful that journalists, investors, and business partners hesitated to ask the hard questions. With Shultz, Holmes even found a pipeline into Washington's political elite. The symbolism was clear. Theranos wasn't just another startup. It was a national project, something too important to doubt. At the same time, Holmes relied heavily on Sunny Balwani, a 40-something software executive who had made a fortune during the dot-com boom. Balwani was not only Theranos' president and chief operating officer, but also Holmes' secret romantic partner. Their relationship was hidden from employees, but inside the company, Balwani operated as an enforcer. While Holmes charmed investors with her vision, Balwani kept employees in line with an iron fist. Together, they formed a dual leadership style. She was the public visionary, and he was the internal hammer pushing people to meet impossible goals and silencing dissent. Theranos' partnerships began to expand rapidly. Walgreens announced a collaboration to put testing machines in pharmacies across America. Safeway invested hundreds of millions of dollars to integrate Theranos clinics into its grocery stores. To outsiders, these deals were proof that the technology worked. After all, why would such major corporations tie themselves to something unproven? The truth, however, was that Holmes was a master of smoke and mirrors. She carefully staged demonstrations for potential partners, showing results that were either cherry-picked or produced by traditional lab equipment hidden in the background. The Edison machine, the supposed miracle device, was still riddled with errors. But with every handshake, the illusion grew stronger. Holmes's public appearances only reinforced the myth. She spoke at conferences about democratizing healthcare, using her trademark husky voice to project confidence and authority. She told stories about watching her uncle die from cancer because it wasn't detected early enough, promising that Theranos would prevent tragedies like his. Audiences were captivated, not realizing that many of her stories were exaggerated or impossible to verify. The media, desperate for a story about a female tech leader in a male-dominated industry, elevated her even further. She became a symbol of empowerment, not just innovation. She was young, she was female, and she was taking on an entrenched medical establishment. The narrative was too good to resist. By now, Holmes was moving in elite circles far beyond Silicon Valley. She met with former presidents, dined with billionaires, and was invited to the White House. Her charisma opened doors that most entrepreneurs could only dream of. In many ways, Theranos became a cult of personality. Employees and investors didn't just believe in the company, they believed in Holmes. And once people invested their reputations, money, or careers, they had little incentive to question what they were being told. The ecosystem of power, money, and influence surrounding Theranos acted like a force field against doubt. But underneath the glow of media attention and boardroom applause, cracks were already forming. Engineers struggled daily with malfunctioning machines. Patients were receiving questionable results during early tests. Inside the labs, whispers of doubt spread, but they rarely reached the outside world. Holmes and Balwani controlled information with an iron grip, firing or intimidating anyone who asked too many questions. Yet for now, the empire held. On paper, Theranos was a triumph. Holmes was a billionaire, her investors were dazzled, and the media hailed her as the next tech messiah. What no one realized was that this empire was built not on science, but on sand. The higher Theranos climbed, the further it had to fall, and the fall was coming sooner than anyone expected. The first serious cracks in Theranos's carefully crafted image began to show not in boardrooms or glossy magazines, but in quiet conversations behind closed doors. Inside the company, engineers and lab technicians were fighting a losing battle with machines that simply would not deliver the results promised. The Edison device, which was supposed to process hundreds of tests from a few drops of blood, often produced wildly inaccurate results. Sometimes it couldn't even complete the tests at all. To keep up appearances, employees were ordered to run patient samples on traditional Siemens analyzers hidden in back rooms, while Theranos claimed the results came from its revolutionary machines. This deception created a culture of fear and secrecy, where questioning the official narrative could cost someone their job. Some employees began to feel that what they were doing wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. Real patients were beginning to receive faulty results. Women were told they might be experiencing miscarriages when they weren't. Others were misled about serious conditions like cancer or HIV. For a company promising to save lives, these errors were catastrophic. Yet anyone who raised concerns found themselves silenced by Sunny Balwani, who ruled the labs with intimidation. He threatened lawsuits, reminded workers of the non-disclosure agreements they had signed, and pushed them to remain loyal to Holmes's vision. The sense of paranoia inside Theranos was suffocating. Employees were watched closely, emails were monitored, and some even reported being followed after leaving the company. Among those disturbed by what they saw were former employees like Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz. He tried to raise concerns internally, but when no one listened, he eventually became one of the whistleblowers who spoke to reporters. Others, including lab workers who felt morally conflicted about what was happening, also began reaching out. Their accounts caught the attention of John Carreyrou, a journalist at the Wall Street Journal. Carreyrou had built a reputation for exposing corporate fraud, and when whispers about Theranos reached him, he knew there was a story worth investigating. At first, Holmes and her team did everything they could to block the journal's investigation. Lawyers from the powerful firm Boies Schiller Flexner, led by famed attorney David Boies, went after sources aggressively. They sent threatening letters, tried to intimidate whistleblowers, and even showed up at people's homes. Holmes personally called Rupert Murdoch, who owned the Wall Street Journal and was also an investor in Theranos, hoping to kill the story. Murdoch, however, declined to intervene, leaving Carreyrou free to pursue the truth. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published its bombshell report. The article revealed that Theranos had been secretly using commercial machines instead of its own technology, and that its devices were unreliable and prone to producing false results. The story rocked the business world. For the first time, the public began to question whether Theranos was truly the revolutionary company it claimed to be. Investors panicked. Walgreens began to rethink its partnership, and regulators started taking a closer look. Holmes responded with defiance. She appeared on television calling the journal's reporting factually and scientifically erroneous. She told audiences that Theranos was under attack because it dared to challenge the medical establishment. In interviews, she projected the same calm confidence that had charmed investors for years, dismissing the allegations as noise from disgruntled former employees. For a moment, it seemed as if she might weather the storm. Her board members stood by her, the media gave her platforms to defend herself, and many of her most loyal investors refused to believe she had misled them. But behind the scenes, the tide was turning. Regulators from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, launched inspections of Theranos's labs. What they found was damning poor quality control, unqualified staff running complex tests, and a system that put patients at serious risk. Former employees continued to come forward each account, adding to the mounting evidence that Theranos was built on lies. The company's once impenetrable aura of secrecy was crumbling, and Holmes's ability to spin the story was beginning to fail. The journal's reporting didn't just expose flaws, it opened the floodgates. Other outlets followed up with their own investigations, and soon the narrative around Theranos shifted from admiration to suspicion. The Silicon Valley press that had once praised Holmes now asked how so many smart, powerful people had been fooled for so long. Patients who had received questionable results came forward with their own stories, adding a human cost to what was once seen as just a business scandal. The dream of revolutionizing healthcare was unraveling, and in its place was a nightmare of deception and risk. Theranos had spent years building a fortress of credibility, but the journal's report had found the cracks in the walls. What followed would not just be the slow decline of a startup, but a public implosion unlike anything the tech world had ever seen. And as investigations deepened, the world would learn just how far Holmes and Balwani were willing to go to protect their empire, even as it began to collapse around them. Once the Wall Street Journal tore open the illusion, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. Public doubt transformed into official scrutiny, and the federal government began to peel back the layers of Theranos's operations. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, better known as CMS, released a scathing report in early 2016 after inspecting the company's labs. They found unsafe practices, unqualified personnel running complex tests, and evidence that patient health was being put at risk. The report was a devastating blow to a company that had built its entire reputation on the promise of medical accuracy. Regulators barred Elizabeth Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years, a penalty that, in reality, threatened the very survival of Theranos. But Holmes refused to admit defeat. She stood on stage at conferences, smiling and calm, telling audiences that her company would fix the problems, that setbacks were part of innovation. Her defiance was striking. But for many, it only deepened the sense that she was unwilling to confront reality. Meanwhile, the partners who once believed in Theranos began to retreat. Walgreens, which had invested heavily and installed Theranos testing centers in its stores, suspended its partnership. Safeway, which had spent hundreds of millions building clinics in anticipation of Theranos' devices, quietly wrote off its losses. The dream of revolutionizing everyday healthcare access was unraveling in real time. Patients who had trusted Theranos with critical medical tests started speaking out. Some told stories of false alarms being told they might be miscarrying or facing a life-threatening illness when they were not. Others feared that incorrect results might have led them to ignore genuine medical problems. The scandal was no longer about technology or money. It was about human lives caught in the fallout of a grand illusion. The Securities and Exchange Commission soon joined the fray, investigating whether Theranos had deliberately misled investors. The company had raised over $700 million from powerful figures who believed in Holmes's vision, many of them dazzled by her confidence rather than convinced by hard science. SEC investigators began examining whether Holmes and Balwani had lied about the capabilities of their machines, the scope of their partnerships, and the accuracy of their tests. What they uncovered painted a picture not of a struggling startup, but of a systematic campaign of deception. Media outlets that had once praised Holmes now treated her as a cautionary tale. Headlines shifted from "The Next Steve Jobs" to Silicon Valley's greatest fraud. Television hosts who had once welcomed her now pressed her with questions she could not answer. Late-night comedians mocked her voice, her wardrobe, and her carefully crafted persona. The public fascination that had elevated her also made her downfall a spectacle. Theranos became a household name not for changing medicine, but for betraying trust on a colossal scale. Inside the company, morale collapsed. Employees who had once felt proud to be part of something world-changing now scrambled to distance themselves from the fallout. Some testified to regulators, others spoke anonymously to the press, and a few began preparing for lawsuits. Holmes and Balwani, however, kept up appearances. They insisted the company was on the verge of breakthroughs, that the criticism was exaggerated. But the harder they fought to preserve the facade, the faster it crumbled. The final blow came when Walgreens filed a lawsuit against Theranos, demanding to recoup a portion of its losses. Investors followed with suits of their own, accusing the company of fraud. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation. What had started as whispers of doubt in secret lab rooms now became a full-scale reckoning with prosecutors, regulators, and furious investors, all demanding answers. For Holmes, the transformation was staggering. Just months earlier, she had been hailed as the youngest self-made female billionaire, a symbol of Silicon Valley's promise. Now she was being compared to Bernie Madoff, the architect of history's largest Ponzi scheme. Her black turtlenecks no longer projected genius, but deception. Her unwavering stare no longer inspired confidence, but suspicion. Theranos, once valued at $9 billion, was worth virtually nothing. The company dissolved partnerships, laid off hundreds of employees, and struggled to keep its doors open. Its once impenetrable boardroom of dignitaries and statesmen had gone silent, unwilling to defend the indefensible. The empire was collapsing in plain sight, and there was no saving it. But the story wasn't over. If anything, the public scandal was just the prelude to an even more dramatic chapter, the courtroom battles that would determine whether Elizabeth Holmes would walk free or spend years behind bars. The collapse of Theranos inevitably set the stage for a legal showdown that captured global attention. In 2018, federal prosecutors charged Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani with multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The allegations were severe, they had misled investors, doctors, and patients about the capabilities of their technology, raising hundreds of millions of dollars while jeopardizing countless lives. What had once been Silicon Valley's most dazzling story of innovation now became a courtroom drama about greed, deception, and the boundaries of ambition. Holmes's trial began in September 2021 after several delays, and it quickly became one of the most closely watched cases in recent memory. Prosecutors painted a picture of a calculated fraud, arguing that Holmes knowingly lied about her machine's abilities, staged demonstrations for investors, and misrepresented partnerships with major corporations like Walgreens and the military. Witness after witness testified about the inner workings of Theranos lab directors who were pressured to sign off on unreliable results, employees who were silenced when they raised concerns, and patients whose health had been put at risk. Some of the most powerful moments came from whistleblowers who described the atmosphere of fear and intimidation created by Holmes and Balwani. The defense, however, attempted a different approach. Holmes's lawyers argued that she was not a criminal mastermind, but a young entrepreneur who truly believed in her vision. They claimed she was guilty of naivety, not fraud. More dramatically, Holmes took the stand in her own defense, breaking years of silence. She admitted to mistakes, but insisted she never intended to mislead. She also alleged that Balwani, more than 20 years her senior, had emotionally and psychologically abused her, controlling her work and personal life in ways that clouded her judgment. Balwani denied these claims, but the testimony added a deeply personal and unsettling layer to the trial. Jurors were left to sift through months of testimony, thousands of documents, and the haunting reality that patients had suffered because of Theranos' false promises. In January 2022, the verdict came down. Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. She was acquitted on a handful of charges, and the jury could not reach a verdict on others, but the message was clear. The woman once hailed as a visionary was now a convicted felon. In November 2022, she was sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison, a stunning fall from grace for someone once celebrated as the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world. Balwani faced his own trial later in 2022. Unlike Holmes, he did not take the stand. The prosecution emphasized his role as the enforcer within Theranos, describing how he bullied employees, silenced dissent, and worked hand in hand with Holmes to present a false picture to investors and regulators. The jury convicted him on all 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy, and he was sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison. The trials did more than assign guilt. They forced a broader reckoning with Silicon Valley's culture of fake it until you make it. In tech, exaggeration is often seen as part of the game. Founders promise more than they can deliver in hopes of attracting investment that will eventually make the dream possible. But in healthcare, where real lives are at stake, the consequences of deception are far more serious. Theranos became the ultimate example of what happens when hype secrecy and blind faith collide with the unforgiving reality of science. Even as Holmes appealed her sentence, the legacy of Theranos lingered. Investors became more cautious, regulators more alert, and journalists more skeptical. For patients, the scandal served as a chilling reminder of how easily trust can be betrayed. And for the public, Holmes's story became a modern morality tale, a warning that charisma and ambition can hide devastating flaws. In May 2023, Holmes reported to prison in Texas to begin serving her sentence. Images of the once celebrated founder walking into custody, far from the stages where she had been cheered as a pioneer, symbolized the final collapse of a myth. Sunny Balwani, too, entered prison to serve his time. Together, they had once dreamed of reshaping the future of medicine. Instead, they left behind one of the greatest scandals in corporate history, a trail of shattered lives and a cautionary tale that will echo for decades. The rise and fall of Theranos is more than just the story of a failed company. It is a mirror reflecting the dangers of unchecked ambition, blind trust, and the seductive power of a good story. For years, Elizabeth Holmes convinced some of the most powerful people in America that she could revolutionize healthcare with a device no one had ever truly seen work. Her charisma, her image, and the myth she built around herself blinded investors, journalists, and partners to the simple fact that the science was never there. In the end, it was not just billions of dollars lost, but the trust of patients who were misled when they needed truth the most. What makes this scandal so chilling is how close it came to becoming permanent. If not for the courage of whistleblowers, the persistence of investigative journalists, and the eventual intervention of regulators, Theranos might have continued to operate in secrecy, putting countless lives at risk. The lesson here is universal. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Innovation should inspire us, but it must always be measured against transparency, accountability, and above all, truth. Theranos will be remembered as a warning etched into the history of Silicon Valley, a reminder that technology cannot bend the laws of science, and that charisma is no substitute for proof. Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani may now sit in prison, but the questions they leave behind are larger than their own downfall. How do we protect ourselves from the next grand illusion? And who will be the next dreamer whose vision is too irresistible to doubt? If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. More shocking scandals, hidden truths, and corporate downfalls are waiting to be uncovered.